Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on gender-responsive national adaptation plan processes. My name is Christian Ledwell and I'm the program manager for the NAP Global Network. For those of you who aren't familiar with the network, as you'll have seen in our intro video, the NAP Global Network is a group of individuals and institutions working to enhance national adaptation planning and action in developing countries. The network was created in 2014 by adaptation policymakers and practitioners, and it now connects over 600 participants from over 100 countries. Through our activities, the network facilitates sustained peer learning and exchange. We support national-level action on NAP development and implementation through a country support hub and through in-country programming. And we work to enhance bilateral support for adaptation through donor coordination with developing countries at the table. Funding for the network is provided by Germany, the United States, Canada, and Austria. The network also produces knowledge products like briefs, blogs, and guidance notes about the NAP process. And we focus on a number of key themes, including looking at how the NAP process can help promote gender equality. Today, we're going to explore this cross-cutting issue of gender. First, we're going to hear from Angie Dazé from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, who will introduce the issue of gender-responsive NAPs. Then we'll hear from Na-Hyeon Shin from Germany's GIZ, who's going to speak about gender-responsive stakeholder engagement and meaningful participation. Third, we'll have an interview with UnaMay Gordon, who is Principal Director of the Climate Change Division in Jamaica's Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And finally, we'd like to hear from you during our question and answer session. Please write your questions in the questions panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we have time for. So to get started, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Angie Dazé, and she's going to provide the introduction.
So to start off our discussions, I'm just going to briefly present a framework that we have developed to guide thinking about gender in NAP processes. So why are we focusing on gender in NAPs? First of all, gender equality is a basic human right, and this is recognized in a number of international conventions, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Second, from decades of experience with development, we know that adaptation efforts will not be effective or sustainable if they don't take gender into account. Thirdly, the NAP process presents an opportunity to address gender inequalities, provided it's undertaken in a gender-responsive manner. And finally, there is a policy imperative to do this, which is established by the UNFCCC and the Sustainable Development Goals. The Paris Agreement really upped the level of ambition on gender by referring to gender-responsive approaches, whereas previous decisions had made reference to being gender-sensitive. When we talk about gender-responsive approaches, it really goes beyond sensitivity to actively promoting gender equality. So it's about promoting equal rights, responsibilities, and opportunities for women and men and girls and boys. This doesn't mean that women and men will become the same, but that people's rights, responsibilities, and opportunities will not depend on whether they're born male or female. Because women often do face particular barriers due to social and cultural norms, gender-responsive approaches often involve specific actions that aim to empower women, both in their households and communities and in broader policy and planning processes. Gender responsiveness requires attention to gender issues throughout all dimensions of the NAP process, from planning through implementation and monitoring and evaluation. When we look at the NAP process with a gender lens, it involves focusing on three key elements. The first is recognizing gender differences in adaptation needs, opportunities, and capacities. The second is about ensuring that participation and influence in adaptation decision-making processes is equitable. And the third is about promoting equitable access for women and men to financial resources and other benefits that result from investments in adaptation. Applying this to the NAP process, we know that this is really designed to be an iterative process involving a cycle of planning, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation. And this cycle is enabled by institutional arrangements, information sharing among different actors, and capacity development. So I'm now going to take you through what it looks like when the NAP process is gender responsive. In the planning phase, integration of gender is important both in terms of the process and the plans that result. So the process must involve gender-balanced participation, which is not just about numbers of women and men, but also about who has influence over the decisions that are made. The plans, whether they are overarching national adaptation plans, sectoral plans, or subnational adaptation plans, must recognize and respond to gender differences in adaptation needs, opportunities, and capacities. When we move to implementation, we need to ensure that prioritization processes and allocation of finance and other resources are gender responsive. We also want to consider equity between women and men in how opportunities, benefits, and losses that result from adaptation actions are shared. For monitoring and evaluation, key issues include the collection of sex-segregated data and gender-differentiated analysis of impacts. Ideally, we would also like to see M&E systems that are set up for the NAP to track progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. When it comes to the institutional arrangements, countries should work towards equitable representation of women and women's organizations. Information sharing systems associated with the NAP process should strive for equitable access to information. And finally, we want to see all actors in the NAP process with the capacities needed to integrate gender considerations. Now, to translate this to a more practical level, I'm going to share a few insights from some work that the NAP Global Network has been doing to assess integration of gender considerations in NAP documents. Over the last few months, we've conducted a systematic review of the NAP documents from 9 countries that were available on NAP Central as of the end of January. It's important to note that the idea of this review is not to call out specific countries on what they have or haven't done, but really to identify common themes and good practices that can be used to develop recommendations for the way forward. So I'm just going to share a few of the key findings from the document reviews to give you a sense of how countries are addressing gender in their NAP documents so far. The first is the good news. Most countries are making an effort to integrate gender considerations in their NAP documents. Almost all of the documents that we reviewed mention gender. And among these, the most common approaches are to identify gender sensitivity as a principle for the plan and/or to identify gender as a priority sector or adaptation option within the plan. The focus of gender integration in NAP documents tends to be on women versus the difference between women and men. And women are most often positioned as a particularly vulnerable group. In the documents we reviewed, all that mention women identify them as a vulnerable group. Women are often also grouped together with youth and the elderly as a collective of most vulnerable groups. They are frequently identified as beneficiaries of adaptation actions. On the other hand, very few of the documents mention their role as agents of change or as stakeholders in adaptation planning processes. Based on this, we can identify a few key gaps that need to be filled for gender-responsive NAP processes going forward. The first is country-specific analysis of gender issues and the implications for climate change adaptation. So we can move beyond these generalizations about women being particularly vulnerable and towards a more nuanced understanding of gender differences and dynamics and what they mean for adaptation. The second is gender-balanced participation in adaptation planning processes. And this applies to both the institutional arrangements associated with the NAP process, which primarily implicate government actors, as well as to stakeholder engagement processes that are undertaken to inform the process. The third point is about capacity development. And this involves both capacity development for climate change actors, so they understand why it's important to integrate gender considerations and how to go about it, and also for gender actors so they can meaningfully engage with the NAP process. And finally, there's a need for deeper and more consistent integration of gender as NAP processes advance. We found that most of the reviewed documents create entry points for integrating gender, but these issues will become even more important as countries move towards prioritization and implementation of adaptation actions, allocation of resources for adaptation, and monitoring and evaluation. I'll just close by flagging that we have a few resources on gender and NAP processes that we've already developed, and these are available now on the NAP Global Network webpage. In addition, in early April, we will be releasing our first synthesis report on gender and NAP processes, which builds on the NAP document review that I just described, and provides a summary of progress to date with recommendations for both NAP country teams and development partners. So I would encourage you to visit our website in the coming weeks to view this report if you're interested in this topic. And I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I will hand over to Na-Hyeon, who will speak about gender responsive stakeholder engagement and meaningful participation.
Yes, thank you very much, Angie. So as Angie has already flagged in her presentation, one key element of a gender responsive NAP process is ensuring equitable participation by men and women in the decision-making processes. So that's what my presentation will be about, and we will start with the question, why does participation matter? What is the general underlying rationale for participatory approaches in policy processes in general? Well, increased participation is basically seen as a means for better policy formulation because it draws on perspectives and ideas from different sections of society. So participatory approaches can create ownership, accountability, and partnerships. They also take into account social and economic needs of stakeholders, and they make use of diverse skills, experiences, and knowledge of those stakeholders. And this ideally results in better designed policy processes, more effective outcome delivery, and more equitable allocation of resources. What is meaningful participation? How can it look like? Of course, we don't have one fixed definition, but we have put together some thoughts on what meaningful participation should entail at least. So meaningful participation is based on the principle that those who are affected by a decision have a right to be involved in the decision-making process. It promotes sustainable decisions by recognizing and communicating the needs and interests of all participants involved. It seeks out and facilitates the involvement of those interested. And it also seeks inputs from participants in designing how they participate. And for that participation, it also provides them with the information they need to participate in a meaningful way. And finally, it communicates to participants how their input has, in the end, affected the decision. So now I come quickly to the steps how to engage stakeholders along the NAP process. So the first steps for stakeholder engagement are usually a stakeholder mapping and an analysis. That means identifying the groups and institutions that will be impacted by the climate change outcomes or can have an effect on them, and then analyzing what the stakeholders can bring to the table to facilitate development and implementation of the NAP. Furthermore, steps are information sharing and awareness raising, and of course, consultative processes and engagement. And a really genuine integration of gender into policy development needs to be done at each stage of the project cycle, which also was mentioned in Angie's presentation. So the entire cycle from stock taking and assessment to implementation to monitoring and evaluation. And at GIZ, our team is currently working on a gender and NAP and NDC guidance that will show entry points to mainstream gender in the NAP process. And it will also link to our tools that are already in place and where to best use them. So it's currently in development and will be finalized this year. So you can ask me about it after the presentation. So lastly, what are enabling factors that can help? First of all, all actors involved should commit to gender responsiveness. That's the first step. That starts with being really aware of the issue and goes further to genuinely acknowledging the importance of gender integration, and then furthermore translating this knowledge into concrete action. That means to critically examine your own structures and then build evidence by gathering and analyzing information. In Nepal, there are currently ongoing efforts like this. They have established a working group on gender equality and social inclusion, which is 1 out of 9 thematic working groups. And the group on gender equality and social inclusion includes government actors as well as community-based organizations, and also makes efforts to include a group of mixed actors. That means participants are service providers, but also beneficiaries, enablers, and advocates. And they also have started to enhance gender balance across all of the other 8 working groups. So I heard that women's participation is still low, but I found it was a very encouraging case to show commitment to the gender issue, where it all starts basically. So the next enabler we identified was the institutional linkage between gender and climate change. That means, first of all, that advocacy units in some form have to be established that have the mandate to influence planning processes across all development sectors regarding gender issues, and which promote the gender issue and give advice to the other various government units. Going further, gender focal points can also be placed in other ministries. This was actually the case in Ethiopia, where they have a gender focal team permanently sitting within the Ministry of Environment to ensure gender mainstreaming in their ministry's policies and programs. Another enabler is, of course, the capacity building, especially for women and women's groups. For women to be able to participate in a meaningful way, it's necessary to invest in their capacity through advocacy and leadership training in order to build skills and confidence to make their voices heard. This involves steps such as improving information to women and men on climate change, and especially on the different impacts of climate change on men and women. It also includes making women and men aware of their rights and the laws, policies, and institutions that govern their lives. It also involves creating a more enabling environment to engage in decision-making in general through political, legal, economic, and cultural changes that give them greater control over resources and decision-making power. And methods to do so are, of course, conducting trainings with women and women's organizations at the required level. It can also be to provide national and local women's groups with a platform for dialogue to exchange on experience and the development of best practices and so forth. And it can also be to facilitate open spaces for dialogue with decision makers, so that women's needs, perspectives, and strengths as agents of change are really taken into account at a higher level. And our last enabler, meaningful participation has to be enabled by meeting on equal footing. That means the participation should be supported by equity measures if necessary. That regards using participatory techniques. For example, a process may be needed to engage women and men separately to address issues that they might otherwise be reluctant to express in a mixed group. Or facilitators can support participants who are hesitant to speak up, which might also require identifying trusted intermediaries, such as community leaders who bring the concerns of a group forward. And it also means considering language and literacy issues that may represent barriers to participation. Also, the facilitation of the participation itself has to be adjusted. For example, the timing and location of the meeting has to be set in such a way that it does not make participation difficult for either men or women. Other examples are childcare assistance or assistance with transportation to get to the venues, And in a lot of locations, security issues have to be considered. So these are all ideas on how gender responsive participation could be enabled through just a few strategic considerations. And I will finish with some next steps. We recently held a peer exchange forum, a targeted topics forum from the NAP Global Network, where participants from around 20 countries came together and addressed the issue of gender in NAPs. And at the end of the session, depending on their national context and the progress in the NAP process, countries were asked to identify concrete next steps that they would take when they get back to their home countries. So I listed just some examples here as inspiration. For example, ensuring that gender is well represented in the national NAP team. So one country had already a national NAP team and they wanted to appoint a focal point for gender. Another example was to establish a working group, which we heard from the country example earlier, to hold a workshop to identify stakeholders in the first place, or the other way around, to give a training for gender experts on climate change adaptation. Another example was also the issuance of a guidance document on gender and climate responsive policies. I think that was based on an example from Peru, which has recently developed an action plan for gender and climate change. So these were just some inspirational examples of concrete steps that can be taken to increase gender responsiveness for the NAP process. Thank you. The guidance tool, as I said, is currently under development and will be published once finished on our adaptation community net website, which I have loaded up here. So feel free to join here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Na-Hyeon. We're receiving a number of questions, which is great. If you'd like to ask a question, please just take a look at the control panel. There's a section called questions, so if you can just type them in, we'll ask them in the final segment of the webinar. So next, we're very lucky to have with us today UnaMay Gordon, who is the Principal Director of the Climate Change Division in Jamaica's Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. UnaMay is a real champion for Jamaica's NAP process and a great advocate for gender equality, and so we're quite excited to have you here with us today. How are you today, UnaMay?
I'm fine, thank you, Christian. I'm well, thank you. Greetings from Jamaica.
Thanks so much for joining us. So my first question is, why do you think it's important to integrate gender considerations in the NAP process?
Well, let me probably take Angie's and presentation as points of departure to my response, and hope that at the end of the webinar and at the end of the presentations, and as we advance our own NAP process, we will continue to benefit from our engagement in the NAP network. It has been a really rewarding experience. I think I'll start with what we already know, that climate change itself will increase the hazard posed by natural disasters. And so if we start from the premise that the impacts of climate change and the resultant disaster will affect men and women in different ways, then it becomes more important to have a gender NAP process. And that I want to make the point that, as we say in the division, that climate change is not gender neutral. And so we're starting from that premise. From an adaptation point of view, and I hope my colleague Ovil is listening, because this was his mantra, that adaptation is local and therefore must be managed through a process and not just a single event. And if that process is to be successful, we need everybody at the table to craft the solutions and to advance in our process. So we probably will need joint actions in some instances and separated actions just to address the differential vulnerabilities across the table and that exists in the process. And I think, as I said in the past, that we need the right mix and balance of people discussing their realities and the realities of climate change. If we are to give, if that is to, and that will give us a better chance of the behavioral change that we require and the mindset change that we all advocate for. Thanks.
Thank you. Adaptation and gender are both cross-cutting issues. So how do your government's institutional arrangements help link adaptation and gender?
That's a good one, because I think from a Jamaica point of view, we have made progress. As you know, the government of Jamaica has a long-term development plan, our Vision 2030 Jamaica. We also have a climate change policy framework, which is set within this Vision 2030 plan. And then we have gender equality, a policy for gender equality. The climate change division itself, of which I'm the head, as you said, we have responsibility to implement the climate change policy framework. And within the framework, it calls for the establishment of a focal point network. These are persons that are identified across all the ministries, departments, and agencies of government and allied institutions to support the integration of climate change into policy plans and programs of the agencies. But we also have gender focal points in these ministries, departments, and agencies. And therefore, the climate change division continues to take concrete steps to ensure that there is coordination and dialogue between the climate change focal point framework and the gender focal points. And we are happy to say that the climate change focal point network itself has 51% of women, which is truly reflective of the balance in the wider society. And in fact, in June of this year, as part, I think Na-Hyeon mentioned that it was one of the things that came out of the TTF, that in fact we have advanced the process a little bit more, that in June, we will be hosting the first joint workshop between the two groups to advance these linkages. And we are hoping that coming out of that, we will identify some critical indicators for measurement as we go along. We have the representatives of the Ministry of Gender sits on the steering committee of the project throughout the NAP process as we develop our NAP and as the NAP efforts is coordinated. And within the CCD itself, gender parity is a key value of the CCD and its staff. So, and we're quite aware of integrating gender in the work as a principle of sustainable development. So, steps are being taken, and as you know, women are involved in the leadership of the division and in the leadership and implementation of the projects at our level. I think under the sector strategies and action plan, which we have advanced as our process, it calls for careful consideration of gender in all the project components. I think overall, from an institutional point of view, we have made significant progress to ensure that there is equity and parity going along.
So there's clearly a lot of impressive work going on, and these principles are very important to your work. What challenges have you faced in addressing gender considerations in adaptation planning in Jamaica?
That's an old one, because I think it's the same challenge that we see coming back. I think we have made, as I said, we have made advances in terms of the the policy on gender equality, but it is an old challenge that we all face. When we introduce the topic of gender, it automatically translates into a woman's issue. And so effort is being made to ensure that there is a greater understanding of gender as opposed to women's issue. And I think Angie articulated that quite well in our presentation. It always answers in, or the question always comes up, how many women do we have in that? And then and then that translate, okay, we have gender balance. And also one of the other challenge, and I think sometimes we tend, or there's a tendency to present women as victims instead of equal partners and agents of change in the process. And I think as we go along, while we recognize these challenges, we will also turn them into opportunities and to our own benefit. But I think overall, I think we have made significant progress in the process.
So when you said a statistic like the gender balance in the NAP focal point network, what's worked for you in ensuring gender balance in stakeholder consultations? How did you achieve this kind of this progress that you've, and how did you get to this point?
I think, as I said, there's a clear recognition that we have to remove these barriers. There's a clear recognition of the challenges we face, of the perception that is there, and there's a clear recognition that we have to broaden the interpretation of what the understanding of gender. So having the climate change policy framework last year, so we in 2017, the climate change division having the responsibility for implementation of the policy framework, we commissioned a gender analysis of the climate change policy framework. And in that paper, which we are fine-tuning and finalizing, and we'll share with our many stakeholders, some entry points for integrating gender into the NAP process was clearly identified. And we are actively acting on those, some of those recommendations. And I hope that the workshop that we are having in June will also advance our process. Also, at the level of the climate change division, when we actively update our stakeholder registry and to ensure that women's organizations, men organizations, and the relevant stakeholders are targeted to ensure that we have some equity in how we deliver our programs and our plans. And so I think that has been working well for us.
Terrific. So small islands in the Caribbean are a fairly unique context, and there seems to be quite a lot of buy-in for the work that you're doing. What advice would you have for other countries aiming to undertake stakeholder consultations that are gender balanced, maybe in a context where some of these issues are a bit more challenging to get on the agenda?
We because of our cultural norms, how the political system is structured, how the role of women have played out in our societies, we know that there are entrenched gender equalities, and that climate change will only exacerbate these. And so probably the primary advice that I will give is that we have to continue to make a concerted effort. We have to engender the commitment of our government and to keep at it for gender equality. And as I said, set within the Vision 2030, we have to ensure that there are implementable actions and that there are real indicators that we can monitor and report. As I alluded before, there has to be effort to foster better understanding of gender and climate change and the linkages that obtained. And I think Angie mentioned in the earlier presentation about the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and we have to bring that forward and focus a little bit on it. We have to remind ourselves that technology transfers will be needed if the Paris Agreement goals are to be met. And therefore, the national adaptation planning process, if that is to be successful, technology has to be gender sensitive. So, and if they are not, then we are starting from a position of failure at the beginning. So we need the cultural shift, we need the commitments of our government, and we need increased understanding and to continue to build the linkages. I think those basic advice that we are taking on board ourselves as we craft our way forward.
Well, those are really clear and helpful next steps. Are there any closing thoughts or any additional points you'd like to make about how to make NAP processes more gender responsive?
My only closing thoughts, Christian, is that I believe that if we, as we are doing here, if we strengthen the institutional and stakeholder capacities to apply the gender lens, and we want to ensure that gender is taken as a lens and not as what we see happening in some places where gender is considered a developmental issue, because it's a lens that we want to apply. And if we strengthen the capacity to use the lens and to apply the lens, I think we will see much progress in the process. As I said, Jamaica has made significant strides in mainstreaming gender and sensitizing the population on the meaning of gender. We have some way to go, but I think we have made some progress, and I think we need to identify more concrete entry points to further integrate into the adaptation plan. We hope that as we advance our sector strategy and action plan process, to not only highlight the gender differences, but to take steps to promote gender equality in all the respective sectors. In a nutshell, we want to ensure that, as I started, that in the final analysis, women are taken as equal partners and equal contributors to the process. And finally, as my friend, the saying goes, if you do something for me without me, then really it is not for me. So we want everybody at the table to craft the interventions. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Well, I would like to open it up now to the whole panel to answer some of the questions that we've received online. And so the first question that we've received, is there a state whose gender-responsive NAP process can be used as a template by developing countries and by SICs? So if I can get Angie, Na-Hyeon, and UnaMay back on the line, if would anyone like to take that first question? Is there a template that can be used for gender-responsive NAP processes?
Probably, I don't think, maybe Christian, I don't think there is a template, because, as I said, your national reality have to inform the process, and therefore there is clear methodology of integration, but from a template point of view, we have not seen where a template works, but that we are informed by our natural national realities. The cultural norms in the country has a great role to play. The role of women in society and decision making has a role to play as well, and how advanced we are in integrating women in the decision-making process, and also the view of men. We know that the network has prepared guidelines, but as I said, the national process and the local context will influence that process.
Thank you, and I think that a lot of the peer learning that we've done through the network reinforces that the NAP process really needs to be country-driven. And I would just like to mention, just for a plug for the network, we host the Country Support Hub, which can, if not, because a template may not be possible, but we can help pull together some examples, like all of the great work that Jamaica has done. And if you're working on a NAP process, we can provide some of those examples to maybe inform how a gender responsive NAP process is developed in your own country, if that's something that you're working on. Na-Hyeon or Angie, did you want to jump in on that question at all?
Sure. I completely agree with UnaMay that this is not an issue where a template can really be developed. But I think just building on what you've said, I think by engaging with a number of different countries, and the Targeted Topics Forum that we had last month was a really great opportunity to do so, in dialogue on how they are addressing this tricky issue of gender in their NAP processes, is really helping us to kind of identify sort of common themes, common challenges, common entry points that will lead to hopefully being able to draw out good practices on this issue. And I think that's what we have begun with this first synthesis report that we'll be releasing in the coming weeks, is to try, based on these very early experiences with NAP processes and integrating gender, to try and identify what some of those common ways forward may be based on experience to date.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I'm also not aware of a kind of template that is out there right now. I can just maybe hint again to the guidance that we are currently developing again. Hello? Okay.
Hello.
Sorry.
The guidance that we are currently developing, it will go along the NAP process, along the elements, and then flag which tools could be used. But indeed, we are trying to feed it with examples from countries. But as Angie said, it's a quite early stage yet, and we will try to use as many national examples as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is, beyond the theoretical concepts, would it be possible to share with us concrete examples about gender-responsive adaptation actions that can be implemented in the field? So, once the National Adaptation Plan has been launched, what is a good example that jumps out for all of you in your work of gender-responsive adaptation action?
Maybe I can start. I think this is a really context-specific question. What makes sense in one context, both from a climate change adaptation point of view and from a gender equality point of view, may not make sense in another context. So I'm reluctant to say this action is gender responsive. I think what's really important from my point of view when we get down to the implementation of adaptation on the ground is looking at who does what in a household, in a community, how will those activities be affected by climate change, and what needs to be done to reduce those vulnerabilities, while at the same time acknowledging that some people within a community may face barriers to taking those actions, and that may require additional focus to ensure that we're addressing imbalances in access to opportunities, in rights, in decision-making power, so that we're sort of looking at what different people need, what women, men, women and men in different groups, what they need to effectively adapt.
I think one of the things that we're being careful in doing as well is to use the sex disaggregated data to craft the adaptation measures and to implement the options. And I think it is really specific to, as I said, the local condition, and it will inform the process as we go along. There's absolutely no way that you will be able to lump the experiences of men and women in crafting the actions, and so it's a very tricky question to answer across the board, but efforts are being made, and I think, as I said, we probably need, as we go along, to find the indicators that will measure. So down the line, we can have some recorded best practices, as I think Angie mentioned before, in terms of documentation of what works across countries, and then we can have some comparative to share.
Thanks so much. And I think that leads really well into the next question, which is how NAP M&E has addressed gender issues both in progress and outcome monitoring and evaluation.
For us, we were talking earlier about the completion of the sector strategies and action plans, and we want to ensure that the plans come complete with both a financial plan and therefore to ensure that there is equitable distribution of the resources for implementation, and the benefits that will accrue, but also that it comes with a monitoring and evaluation plan with clear indicators for measuring the equality or the inequality in the process. Not there yet, but we hope that as the process advances, we will get there.
And I think that, you know, as UnaMay said, I think many countries are sort of in the process of developing M&E systems. But I think one thing that I would like to mention is just that, you know, obviously a very basic first step is ensuring that sex disaggregated data is collected. But that's not enough. If that data is not analyzed in a way that provides insights into who is benefiting, who is not, who is making progress on adaptation, you know, how are investments distributed among different members of a community. So I think it's, you know, sex disaggregated data is a very important piece of the puzzle, but if that data is not analyzed effectively to understand both the process and the outcomes from adaptation, then we're missing a big piece of what gender responsive M&E would look like.
Totally agree, Angie. Totally agree. And as I said, we have to ensure that even in the implementation guidelines and implementation plans, that these are also gender sensitive. I think that is a big part of the puzzle as well. So we craft a plan, and then we craft an implementation plan, and sometimes we forget that it has to run right along the continuum.
Thanks so much. Our next question is, why is there overemphasis on women most often when gender issues come up? Who speaks for the youth, boys and girls? And are they also engaged in decision-making processes? case studies and experiences would be appreciated. The person who asked the question has said. So I think, who would like to take this one now?
I can speak about the youth. We, from a governance point of view as well, the climate change division is supported by a climate change advisory board, which reports to the minister, and which also advises the minister on climate change issue. And we have ensured that the voice of the youth is represented on that board. The climate change focal point network as well, the Ministry of Youth is also represented on that board. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had a nice sit down with the Child Development Agency to see how we can crowd in a little bit the Child Development Agency. But as I said at the beginning, it is a process, and also a learning process for a lot of the countries. I think, as I said, we have made advances in terms of the integration of gender and demystifying the gender construct a little bit. But from a climate change point of view, it is a learning process as we go along, and therefore, as the process emerge and as the process gain momentum, that steps are being taken to, and I don't want to say the vulnerable groups, to include all the players at the table so that the decision that is crafted for them represents their own realities.
Thanks, UnaMay. Our next question is for Angie, and it says, in many developing countries, the gender machineries are very weak with limited capacities in most gender bureaus. The question is, if adaptation is seen as a less urgent matter, how can we ensure that there is a clear understanding and that sufficient attention to the prioritization of adaptation-related activities is undertaken?
That's a huge question. I guess one thing that I would say on that is, I mean, yes, completely recognize that there are capacity challenges in terms of human resources and access to data and, you know, all of these issues that sort of create barriers to effective integration of gender in the NAP process. But one issue that I think is really interesting that came out in our discussions with countries at the Targeted Topics Forum is the framing of adaptation. So in many countries, adaptation is really framed as a very technical issue. It's looking at different sectors such as agriculture and water and infrastructure and how those sectors are affected by climate change and what can be done. And so trying to bring in this really social issue of gender equality can be really difficult. So I think that part of sort of kicking off this process and establishing dialogue and helping people to understand the importance of integrating gender and adaptation is recognizing that adaptation is also very much a social issue, and a lot of it is about behavior change and access to information and how decisions are made, and that all of this is really important, particularly at the local level. And I think if you come at it from that perspective, it can make it easier to then make the links to gender inequality and how it may inhibit adaptation efforts.
Thanks. And I think we're getting close to the hour, so we only have time for one more question, unfortunately. Because it's World Water Day, I think I'll go with a question from Sarah Oppenheimer. How can the water sector contribute to improve gender equality within climate adaptation processes?
Wow. That's a big one. But you know, this week we have yesterday was World Day of Forest, or World Forestry Day, and today is World Water Day, and a lot of the work that surrounds adaptation surrounds water in one form or the other. Water coming from the forest, more intense storms, and therefore it will come with water, And so from our point of view here in Jamaica, we have been doing a couple of things to ensure that the water sector in its own right is represented and contributes to the process. We have a water policy, a clear water policy, which is totally climate proof and has climate change consideration embedded throughout the policy document. And we are developing an adaptation plan for the sector and also an armor for the water sector, which we just commissioned a couple of weeks ago and started in terms of the engagement of the stakeholders. So from both sides, because the water sector is also the biggest user of energy as well, and there needs to be some adaptation there as well from the water sector. So if we say how can the water sector contribute or benefit, the water sector is probably one of the central plank. In the countries, the lack of water, the drought, especially in the rural communities. And as you said, it then becomes a social issue. And if it is taken in that construct, then there is really not much more I could say in terms of what is it and the role of the water sector to position itself to support and advance the NAP process. It is almost, as we say, our most valuable resource, and therefore the household at all levels, at the watershed level, at the city level, at the household level, it is the resource that is most valued and most sought after. And if it is not protected and preserved within the process that we are moving along, then I think our societies will not benefit if we don't have that clear recognition of the role that the sector itself will play.
Thanks so much. And I think that takes us to the hour, unfortunately, but I do want to apologize to those people whose questions we didn't get to, but a huge thanks to our presenters, UnaMay Gordon, Na-Hyeon Shin, and Angie Dazé. We've recorded this webinar, and we'll be posting it on our website along with the PowerPoint presentations that you've seen. There's a short evaluation survey that will be launched at the end of the webinar, and we'd really appreciate if you could fill that out. It'll also be shared in a follow-up email to participants. Before we close, I just wanted to give a quick sense of how you can get involved with the network. A first step is to sign up and register online as a participant, and this is free, open to everyone, and can be done on an individual basis. We keep participants up to date on webinars like these and other activities, as well as our recent publications, knowledge products, and other NAP-related news. Participants working for developing country governments can access short-term targeted technical support through our country support hub and get involved in peer learning and exchange through our South-South peer exchange program. Bilateral donor participants can collaborate with us to share information about where you're working, coordinate with other donors, and participate in network meetings and activities to learn from other donors in partner countries. And as always, don't hesitate to be in touch with us through the email address on your screen if you have any questions or are interested in learning more about how you can get involved with the NAP Global Network. Thanks again so much for joining us, and we hope that you'll be able to join us next time. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.